The ranch, my rules, and my daughter's pride had survived the ordeal, and in that survival, I found inspiration that went beyond a single day or a single conflict. It was a reminder that justice isn't always delivered politely, quietly, or on schedule. Sometimes it arrives in unexpected forms, unconventional methods, or moments that require courage and creativity. That afternoon had been messy, unconventional, and soaked through, but it had also been perfect in its lesson. Resilience matters. Standing firm, thinking carefully, and taking action when necessary allows you to turn even the most audacious challenge into a story of triumph. I paused at the edge of the property, watching the last lingering guests make their way off the ranch, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others still laughing at the absurdity of the day. I looked at Emily, her eyes sparkling with excitement, and I knew that this day would be etched into her memory as a lesson in courage and pride. And in a strange, satisfying way, it had been a gift. Not just a victory over Linda and her overbearing plans, but a reminder of the bond we shared and the values I hoped to pass on to her. Integrity, courage, and the knowledge that home is sacred. As dusk settled over the ranch, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I felt an unshakable sense of inspiration settle over me. The land was quiet again, the boundaries respected, and the lesson learned. Sometimes justice isn't polite, sometimes it's unexpected, and sometimes it comes down to standing up for yourself in the way that only you can. And in that quiet evening light, with Emily laughing beside me and the ranch stretching out in every direction, I knew that this victory, our victory, would be remembered for years to come, not just for the case, but for the unwavering spirit it represented. Sheriff Tom Jenkins had his official truck towed in broad daylight by HOA President Karen Mitchell. A petty act that humiliated him in front of the entire neighborhood. Karen's obsession with rules and her self-righteous arrogance made her think she was untouchable, enforcing her authority without mercy. But Tom stayed calm, observed her careless parking later, and set the stage for karma to strike back perfectly. Just wait to see how Karen's own hubris led to her SUV being towed, and how fairness and justice triumphed in this unforgettable suburban showdown. It was one of those crisp, sunlit mornings in Maplewood, the kind that made suburban streets feel almost cinematic. Birds chirped lazily from their perches on trimmed hedges, and the scent of freshly cut grass drifted across the cul-de-sac. Most residents were still easing into their day, coffee in hand, scrolling through phones or tending to gardens. But there was a different kind of energy in the air for Sheriff Tom Jenkins. Today he had an ordinary agenda: attend the monthly HOA meeting at the community center, touch base on neighborhood concerns, and make sure the rules were being fairly enforced. Nothing dramatic, nothing complicated. Just routine civic responsibility. Tom pulled his official red and white sheriff's truck into a parking spot that seemed perfectly reasonable. From his vantage point, the spot was out of the way, did not block any driveways, and was certainly not a hazard. In fact, he had parked many times in similar spots before, often near the community center during meetings. Yet in that quiet suburban rhythm, a storm was about to break. Across the street, Karen Mitchell, HOA president, self-appointed enforcer of every regulation she could find, stepped onto her front porch. Her posture radiated authority bordering on menace, clipboard clutched tightly in one hand. Karen had earned a reputation for zealously policing every little infraction. A slightly tilted welcome mat, a mailbox with the wrong color numbers, or a garden gnome placed incorrectly. Neighbors often joked about her obsession, but behind the jokes lay genuine frustration. Karen took pride in the minutiae, convinced that strict adherence to rules was the only way to maintain the perfect suburban order she imagined. Her sharp eyes locked on Tom's truck immediately. The subtle relaxation in her morning routine vanished. To Karen, the presence of that sheriff's truck, official, authoritative, yet parked with what she considered reckless disregard, was an affront. She marched down her driveway with purpose, each step firm and deliberate. Residents peered out of windows and doors, sensing the tension before words were exchanged. What could this petty confrontation possibly be about? Karen stopped at the edge of the curb, clipboard in hand, and squinted at the sheriff's truck. The frown on her face deepened, transforming into an expression of outright determination. Illegal parking, she muttered to herself, as though the label alone justified immediate action. Without hesitation, she pulled out her phone, dialed the towing company, and spoke with precision, leaving no room for debate. Within minutes, the tow truck arrived, hydraulic arm extended, ready to lift the familiar red and white vehicle that had long symbolized safety and law in Maplewood. The neighbors who had gathered in quiet curiosity now stood frozen in disbelief. Children paused mid-chalk drawing on the sidewalk. Dog walkers stopped in their tracks. Slowly the tow truck hooked Tom's sheriff truck and began the process of hauling it away. A murmur ran through the crowd. First confusion, then outrage. How could an HOA president wield her authority in such a brazen way? The sheriff, a symbol of law and order, was now the subject of a petty bureaucratic act. Tom himself stepped out of the vehicle, hands slightly raised, wearing a calm but firm expression. He had the instinct of a law enforcement professional, measured, observant, but even he couldn't hide the shock flickering across his face. His reputation, earned over decades of service, was being undermined over a technicality. And yet the act wasn't violent or aggressive in the traditional sense. It was worse in a certain way. It was the slow, deliberate sting of injustice, a humiliation disguised as procedural enforcement. As the tow truck drove away, the quiet Tuesday morning had transformed into a scene of simmering tension. Residents whispered, heads shaking in disbelief. Conversations buzzed over backyard fences. Did she really just tow the sheriff's truck? Is she allowed to do that? That's absurd! Anger, sharp and collective, crackled through the community like static electricity. The air, once tranquil and familiar, now felt charged with indignation. Even from the distance of his truck being carried away, Tom felt the weight of the situation. This was more than a minor inconvenience. It was a symbolic act, a challenge to his authority, a blatant disregard for common sense, and an assertion of power that seemed both unnecessary and petty. The seed of anger, not just for himself but for every neighbor who valued fairness, had been planted. What had started as a routine morning had become the spark of a confrontation that would not be forgotten any time soon. And in the background, Karen Mitchell, clipboard held like a shield, walked back toward her house with the quiet satisfaction of someone who believed she had done her duty. But what she could not see was the brewing storm, the anger, the whispers, the growing sense that this small act of power would have consequences far beyond her control. Sheriff Tom Jenkins sat in his patrol vehicle at the impound lot, the engine humming softly as he tried to process what had just happened. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows over the quiet suburban streets of Maplewood. But for Tom, the warmth did nothing to ease the chill of humiliation that crept through his chest. Moments ago, he had been the symbol of law, of authority, of order. And now he was a man reduced to waiting in line to reclaim his own truck, the very emblem of his profession. He ran a hand over his forehead and exhaled slowly, trying to steady the frustration building inside him. It wasn't just the inconvenience of the tow or the paperwork. It was the principle, the sheer audacity of it all. Karen Mitchell, the president of the HOA, had treated the sheriff's truck as though it were any ordinary vehicle violating a neighborhood regulation. And she had done so with precision, without hesitation, as if every rule she cited carried more weight than decades of public service. The thought made Tom's stomach twist with a combination of disbelief and anger. As he watched her smug smile replay in his mind, clipboard raised like a trophy, the sting of personal injustice deepened. She had done it in full view of the neighbors, and they had seen it. The whispers that spread across the cul-de-sac were no secret. "Can you believe she towed the sheriff's truck?" one neighbor murmured as he walked his dog. "That's just ridiculous," another added under her breath. The community's reaction, though sympathetic, could not undo the fact that Tom's dignity had been publicly undermined. Even the smallest sense of personal pride felt eroded. Inside the impound office, the clerk barely looked up as Tom approached the counter. "Number 23, she said, sliding a ticket across the desk. Tom glanced down, resigned, and settled in the uncomfortable plastic chair. The minutes stretched into an hour, each tick of the wall clock amplifying his frustration. He thought about the meetings he would now be late for, the responsibilities left unattended, and the image of himself in front of his peers as a man made powerless by bureaucracy. It was a rare feeling for someone accustomed to commanding respect and ensuring the safety of others. Karen's presence had lingered in his mind like a shadow. Her meticulous adherence to obscure rules had been relentless. She had cited HOA bylaws that most residents had never even read, each word falling like a hammer that pounded on the idea of fairness. To her, the parking violation wasn't about inconvenience or common sense. It was about asserting control, demonstrating that she was the ultimate authority, even over the sheriff of the town. The cruelty of it wasn't physical, but it carried a weight all its own, the kind that burrows into one's mind and refuses to let go. Tom's colleagues had called to check on him, their voices a mix of amusement and concern. "Seriously, Tom? Towed by the HOA?" One chuckled, yet beneath the surface humor was understanding, a shared recognition that even someone with authority could be vulnerable to petty bureaucracy. He felt isolated in a way he rarely did, stripped of the professional armor that usually protected him from moments like this. By the time his number was finally called, Tom had endured hours of waiting, paperwork, and small talk with the clerk who had little interest in empathizing. He paid the fine, signed the forms, and climbed into the cab of his reclaimed truck. The engine roared to life, but it offered no comfort. What had begun as a shocking act of audacity now lingered as a heavy, almost tangible pain. He had been powerless in that moment, and the knowledge gnawed at him. The humiliation, the erosion of credibility, the subtle shift in perception among the neighbors. Even as he drove away from the impound lot, the quiet streets of Maplewood no longer felt serene. Every lawn, every mailbox, every driveway seemed to carry a reminder of the indignity he had endured. Tom knew one thing with certainty. While Karen Mitchell may have won this small battle, she had lit a fire that would not be so easily forgotten. The sting of injustice was real, and though he felt defeated now, that quiet ache in his chest hinted at a determination that was only beginning to form. By late afternoon, the golden light of Maplewood's sun bathed the suburban streets in a warm glow, softening the edges of the day. Sheriff Tom Jenkins, sitting behind his desk at the station, reviewed the morning's events with quiet determination. The anger and humiliation of the earlier ordeal were still fresh, but now they were being replaced with something more productive: focus. Tom had learned long ago that impulsive reactions rarely led to meaningful outcomes. If he wanted real justice, he would have to be strategic, patient, and smart. He started mapping out the situation in his mind. Karen Mitchell, the ever-zealous HOA president, had a singular weakness: her overconfidence. She believed the rules applied only when it suited her, or when she was enforcing them on someone else. She never considered the possibility that her actions could backfire. Tom smiled faintly, a spark of hope lighting in his chest. Karma, as he liked to think, could be guided, but sometimes it needed a little nudge. The first step was observation. Tom quietly drove past Karen's mansion under the pretense of routine patrol. From a discreet distance, he noticed her black luxury SUV parked haphazardly in the fire lane, a clear violation of the very rules she wielded so strictly over the neighborhood. The irony was delicious, and the sheriff allowed himself a brief private chuckle. Neighbors walking their dogs or checking their mail noticed the vehicle and exchanged knowing glances. Whispers traveled quickly. "Isn't that Karen's car? In the fire lane? After what she did this morning?" The seeds of anticipation had already been sown. Tom didn't rush. He understood that patience amplified the impact of any action. He reached out quietly to the local towing company, a few operators he trusted who had worked with him in the past, and explained the situation. No dramatic announcements, no threats. Just the simple fact that the law applied equally to everyone, even an HOA president who fancied herself untouchable. At the same time, he coordinated with a handful of neighbors who had grown weary of Karen's rigid enforcement. They were discreet, supportive, and shared the quiet thrill of watching justice unfold on its own timeline. As the afternoon stretched on, Tom's hope began to solidify into a tangible plan. The groundwork was being laid. The towing company was aware of Karen's parking violation. Neighbors were ready to witness the inevitable outcome, and he had the moral high ground firmly in place. It wasn't about revenge, it was about fairness. Every detail mattered. Timing, visibility, and legality were critical. He imagined the moment when Karen would finally see the consequences of her hubris, and it gave him a sense of calm satisfaction. Meanwhile, Karen remained blissfully unaware of the storm she was quietly walking into. She returned inside her mansion after checking on her morning victory, confident that she had demonstrated authority and control. In her mind, the day had been perfectly executed. She didn't notice the growing glances from neighbors, the smirks exchanged over backyard fences, or the subtle shifts in conversation that indicated her small empire of rules was about to be tested. Her very confidence, which had once been her greatest weapon, was now creating a vulnerability she could not see. Tom reviewed the logistics one last time. He confirmed the towing company's schedule, made sure all necessary documentation was in order, and double-checked the safety measures. There would be no mistakes, no missteps. Everything had to be beyond reproach. Justice, after all, was not only about consequence, but about presentation. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across Maplewood streets, hope had fully replaced the earlier sting of humiliation. Tom Jenkins knew that the day's events were leading toward a turning point. He didn't need to raise his voice or create drama. The rules themselves, coupled with Karen's own arrogance, were enough to tip the scales. The anticipation in the air was electric, and for the first time since that shocking morning, a smile crept across his face. Fairness was not only possible, it was imminent. The quiet hum of his patrol truck, the gentle breeze rustling the trees, and the faint laughter of neighbors all suggested that the moment of reckoning was close. And Tom, patient and poised, felt a renewed sense of purpose. Sometimes the strongest victories came not from immediate retaliation, but from carefully orchestrated opportunity, and he was ready to let justice unfold in the most satisfying way possible. The morning sun rose over Maplewood with a calm brilliance, casting soft light over the manicured lawns and quiet streets. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dew and freshly mown grass. Karen Mitchell stepped out onto her front porch, coffee mug in hand, expecting another ordinary day of order and control. Her thoughts lingered on the morning's previous triumphs. How she had successfully towed the sheriff's truck and asserted her authority. Pride swelled in her chest as she imagined the respect and fear she commanded among her neighbors. But as she stepped fully onto the driveway, her confident stride faltered. Her eyes widened, and a strange silence fell over the street. There, right in the middle of her own driveway, her black luxury SUV was hooked to a tow truck. A bright yellow tag flapped from the windshield, boldly declaring, "Illegal fire lane parking." Karen's carefully maintained sense of superiority wavered. Her face, usually so composed and assured, drained of color. The street began to stir. Neighbors peeked through blinds, stepped cautiously onto porches, and gathered quietly along the sidewalks. Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the small crowd. "Is that Karen's car?" whispered one neighbor. "In the fire lane?" breathed another. The irony was unmistakable. Karen, who had spent years zealously enforcing every HOA rule, now faced the consequences of ignoring her own regulations. Sheriff Tom Jenkins stepped out from the shadows with a calm smile, his posture relaxed, his presence unthreatening yet commanding. There was no triumphal gloating in his demeanor, only quiet confidence. "Rules apply to everyone," he said evenly, voice carrying just enough to reach the watching neighbors. "Even HOA presidents." Karen blinked, disbelief etched across her features. For a moment she could not speak. The tables had turned, and the magnitude of the situation began to sink in. The humiliation she had imposed on Tom earlier that morning now reflected back upon her tenfold, magnified by her own arrogance. The crowd of neighbors, once passive observers, now erupted into quiet cheers and supportive applause. They had witnessed the reversal, the scales of fairness restored in real time. Tom approached the tow truck operator, confirming that everything was in order. No corners had been cut, the documentation was clear, the rules meticulously followed. Karen had no legal ground to protest, no authority to override what had been carefully orchestrated. The sheriff's calm presence and careful adherence to the law amplified the lesson being learned. Fairness is not selective, and arrogance has consequences. Karen fumbled. trying to pull out her phone, perhaps to call for intervention or appeal, but hesitation and shame held her back. The neighbor's gaze was firm, expectant, and a little amused. Even her closest allies among the HOA committee looked uneasy, sensing that her reign of petty authority had been checked decisively. For the first time, Karen experienced the sting of the very humiliation she had delighted in administering. Meanwhile, Sheriff Jenkins returned to his patrol truck, taking a moment to observe the scene. There was no malice in his actions, only a demonstration that rules and fairness mattered more than ego. Maplewood's residents felt the weight of the lesson. When fairness is applied consistently, it has the power to restore dignity, even after injustice. Children whispered excitedly to one another. Neighbors exchanged approving nods, and the quiet sense of balance that had been disrupted earlier was fully restored. Karen finally turned away, defeated but unharmed, understanding, perhaps for the first time, the responsibility that comes with authority. She would have to reconsider her actions, her rules, and the way she wielded power over others. Tom's calm, methodical approach had not only corrected the imbalance, but had done so in a way that inspired those who had watched from the sidelines. By mid-morning, Maplewood returned to its usual rhythm, yet a subtle change lingered. Residents walked taller, conversations carried more conviction, and a shared sense of justice seemed to settle over the neighborhood. Sheriff Jenkins drove off slowly, the sunlight glinting off his truck, leaving behind a quiet but powerful reminder. Standing firm in fairness can restore order, dignity, and respect even when the odds seem stacked against you. The lesson was clear, unforgettable, and deeply satisfying. Arrogance and petty power trips, no matter how meticulously executed, cannot withstand the steady hand of fairness, integrity, and patience. And Maplewood would remember that day, not for the conflict itself, but for the triumph of principle and the inspiration it left in its wake.